There is a substance sitting in your tires, your shoes, your phone case, and probably a dozen other things within arm's reach of you right now that was once responsible for one of the most horrifying campaigns of forced labor and mass killing in modern history. Not gold, not oil, not diamonds. Rubber. A soft, bouncy, unassuming material that most of us have never once thought to question. But behind its stretchy, harmless surface lies a story of genius, obsession, greed, and atrocity so severe that some historians consider it one of the darkest chapters of the entire colonial era. The story begins not in a factory, but deep in the rainforests of the Amazon, thousands of years before Europeans ever set foot there. Indigenous peoples across Mesoamerica and South America had discovered something remarkable about the sap of a particular tree. When you cut into its bark, a milky white liquid oozed out, and if you let that liquid dry and harden, it became something almost unlike anything else found in nature. A solid material that could stretch, bounce, and snap back into shape. The Olmec and Maya civilizations were using this material to make solid rubber balls for ritual ball games more than 3,000 years ago, some of the oldest evidence of rubber use anywhere on Earth. They also used it to waterproof fabric and footwear, discovering practical applications for this strange substance long before anyone in Europe had any idea it existed. When Christopher Columbus arrived in the Americas in the late 1400s, he reportedly witnessed indigenous people in the Caribbean playing with bouncing balls made from this mysterious substance and was baffled by what he saw. But for centuries afterward, Europeans mostly regarded rubber as a curiosity, an oddity brought back from the New World with no obvious practical use. That should have been the end of the story. A strange novelty, forgotten in a cabinet somewhere. It wasn't, because rubber had one enormous glaring problem that kept it from becoming useful in European hands. It didn't handle temperature well. In the cold, it turned brittle and cracked. In the heat, it turned soft, sticky, and eventually melted into a useless, gooey mess. For decades, rubber remained little more than a scientific curiosity. Interesting, but essentially unusable for any serious industrial purpose. And then in 1839, an American inventor named Charles Goodyear made a discovery that would change everything, reportedly by accident. Goodyear had been obsessively experimenting with rubber for years, going deeply into debt and even facing time in a debtor's prison in his relentless pursuit of a way to stabilize the material. According to the popular account, he accidentally dropped a mixture of rubber and sulfur onto a hot stove, and instead of melting into a sticky mess, it charred slightly but remained firm, flexible, and stable, no longer falling apart in heat or cold. He had discovered vulcanization, a process that transformed rubber's molecular structure, making it durable, weather-resistant, and industrially useful for the very first time. You'd think this single discovery would have made Goodyear enormously wealthy. It didn't. Goodyear spent the rest of his life fighting patent battles, and he died deeply in debt in 1860, never seeing the fortune that his discovery would eventually generate for others. Decades later, an entirely different company would adopt his name to honor his contribution, but Goodyear himself never lived to see the empire his idea would help build. Because once rubber could withstand heat and cold, the world suddenly needed enormous quantities of it. Rubber could be used for waterproof clothing, industrial belts, insulation for the rapidly expanding telegraph and electrical industries, and eventually, most explosively of all, tires. And that single demand triggered a chain of events that would devastate an entire region of the world. At the time, nearly all of the world's natural rubber came from wild rubber trees growing in the Amazon rainforest, primarily in a region that would become part of the Congo Free State in Central Africa, and in Brazil, where the trees grew wild and dense across the jungle. In the late 1800s, a Belgian king named Leopold II set his sights on the Congo, not as a colony belonging to Belgium, but as his own personal, privately owned territory, acquired under the guise of humanitarian and scientific interest at an international conference in 1884 and 1885. Leopold never once set foot in the Congo himself, but from his palace in Belgium, he oversaw a system so brutal that it would eventually shock even the deeply colonized world of the late 19th century. As global demand for rubber exploded, driven by the booming bicycle industry and soon after by automobiles, Leopold's agents in the Congo imposed impossible rubber quotas on local villages. Men were forced to venture deep into the jungle to tap wild rubber vines, often for weeks at a time, under threat of horrific punishment if they failed to meet their quota. And the punishments were almost beyond comprehension. Colonial agents and the private militias enforcing Leopold's system routinely mutilated villagers who failed to deliver enough rubber, most infamously by severing hands, sometimes taking the hands of children if the adults in a village hadn't collected enough. Entire villages were held hostage, burned, or massacred to terrorize the population into compliance. Historians estimate that between 1885 and 1908, the population of the Congo may have been reduced by as much as half, with death tolls estimated in the range of 10 million people through direct violence, starvation, exhaustion, and disease caused by the brutal rubber extraction system. It remains one of the largest atrocities of the colonial era, and it happened almost entirely to satisfy the world's growing hunger for something as seemingly harmless as bouncy, waterproof rubber. Word of the atrocities eventually reached the outside world through missionaries, journalists, and a British diplomat named Roger Casement, whose detailed 1904 report on Congo conditions helped ignite international outrage. Under mounting global pressure, Leopold was finally forced to hand control of the Congo over to the Belgian government in 1908. He died the following year, having personally profited enormously from a system built on the amputated hands of the people he claimed to be civilizing. But nobody expected what happened next on the other side of the world, because the horror in the Congo eventually gave a strange kind of opening to another region entirely, Southeast Asia. By the early 1900s, British and Dutch colonial planters had begun establishing enormous rubber plantations in Malaysia, Ceylon, and the Dutch East Indies, planting rubber trees in neat, cultivated rows rather than relying on wild jungle vines. This should have solved the ethical catastrophe unfolding in the Congo. It actually just shifted the exploitation somewhere else. Plantation rubber in Southeast Asia relied heavily on indentured labor, workers brought in from India and China under contracts that, in practice, often trapped them in conditions barely distinguishable from the forced labor happening in Africa, bound by debt, restricted movement, and grueling working hours in punishing tropical heat. Meanwhile, Brazil's wild rubber boom, centered around the city of Manaus deep in the Amazon, created almost unimaginable wealth for a brief period in the late 1800s and early 1900s. Manaus became known as a jungle city of extraordinary opulence, complete with an opera house built specifically to bring European culture into the heart of the rainforest. But that wealth, too, was built substantially on the forced labor of indigenous Amazonian people and impoverished migrant workers, subjected to debt bondage systems that trapped them in the jungle, collecting sap for rubber barons who lived in almost obscene luxury. That boom collapsed almost overnight in the early 1900s, when a British botanist named Henry Wickham smuggled thousands of rubber tree seeds out of Brazil in 1876, seeds that were successfully cultivated into the very plantations that would soon dominate rubber production across British and Dutch colonies in Asia. Once those Asian plantations began producing rubber far more efficiently than the wild Amazon jungle ever could, Brazil's rubber economy crumbled, and Manaus's extraordinary wealth evaporated almost as quickly as it had arrived. Rubber's importance to the modern world only grew from there. As automobiles exploded in popularity through the 20th century, tires became rubber's single largest use, and entire industrial empires were built around meeting that demand. During World War II, rubber became such a critical strategic resource that when Japan seized control of rubber-producing regions across Southeast Asia, the United States was forced to launch an urgent synthetic rubber program, racing to invent laboratory alternatives that didn't depend on trees at all. That program succeeded, and the synthetic rubber manufactured from petroleum now accounts for a large share of global rubber production, existing alongside natural rubber, which is still harvested from plantations across Southeast Asia today, the same region that took over from the Congo and Brazil more than a century ago. So the next time you climb into a car, or lace up a pair of sneakers, or plug in a cable insulated in something soft and flexible, think about what that material's history actually contains. It contains ancient Mesoamerican ball games played more than 3,000 years ago. It contains an American inventor who nearly bankrupted himself chasing a discovery he never got to profit from. And it contains one of the darkest atrocities of the colonial era, a campaign of terror and mutilation that may have killed as many as 10 million people in the Congo. Also, the rest of the world could have something bouncy, waterproof, and durable. Rubber doesn't look like it could carry that kind of weight, but almost nothing you touch every day has a history as quietly brutal and as strangely human as this one.